Hello everyone, my name is Juan Tauri. I teach criminology into the sociology and social policy program here at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. I want to begin by thanking the facilitators who organised the symposium for giving me an opportunity to address what I believe are some significant issues that not just Māori but Indigenous peoples across all settler colonial jurisdictions have with the performance of the restorative justice industry in relation to our social justice needs. And I also want to thank you all, the participants, for listening in and being part of this discussion, this mahi, this work as we call it here in New Zealand. I've titled my presentation Restorative Justice in the Land of the Long White Lie. And for New Zealand-based participants should actually get how I came to that title. For those of you who don't, the Māori word or name for New Zealand is Aotearoa. It's sort of broadly or generally translates as land of the long white cloud, because as the myth goes, when my ancestors turned up in their canoes and they first saw them in New Zealand, it was, as it usually is, covered in cloud. Okay, and so land of the long white lie is a play on that definition, and the lie that the title refers to is the mythologizing of the restorative justice industry and the policy sector in New Zealand and overseas that presents or represents New Zealand as a restorative justice haven, and that restorative justice practice in New Zealand empowers its Indigenous people. So restorative justice in the land of the long white lie. Now, it's indisputable that New Zealand holds a special place amongst restorative justice advocates and practitioners throughout the world. This is largely the result, in my view, of the introduction in 1989 through the SIPFA Act of the Family Good Conferencing Forum. And subsequently, it was a result also of the way in which the forum has been successfully marketed here in New Zealand and internationally from the mid-1990s onwards. The importance of the Family Good Conferencing Forum to the restorative justice movement, to New Zealand restorative movement's representation of itself and its practice as constructing an RJ haven in New Zealand cannot be overstated, as evidenced by the fact that a significant amount of restorative justice literature references this forum as a significant case study of good RJ practice, especially in relation to representing the way restorative justice can be in tune with and respond respectfully to the needs of marginalised communities like Indigenous peoples. But more broadly, the introduction of the Family Good Conferencing Forum in New Zealand has proven invaluable for the restorative justice movement in two particular ways. Okay, firstly, it significantly aided restorative justice entrepreneurs when they began marketing their programs on an increasingly globalized crime control market in around the early to mid 1990s. Secondly, it provided a valuable resource for settler colonial governments who found themselves grappling with high rates of Indigenous peoples overrepresentation in the offending and imprisonment statistics, but who also were seeking to recuperate control over the narrative of justice after decades of sustained Indigenous critique of settler colonial crime control policies and practices. Now, in the first section, main section of this presentation, I'll briefly discuss the development of restorative justice in New Zealand. Then moving on to part two, where I challenge the prevailing narrative found in the restorative justice lexicon that sustains and at times invigorates this mythologizing, this fiction that New Zealand is a restorative paradise that empowers Māori and Indigenous people. Instead, I argue that the Family Good Conferencing Forum, much lauded as it is by RJ advocates everywhere, has thus far done little to empower Māori, and that the restorative justice industry in New Zealand, most especially its what I would call its academic wing, who we'll talk more about at the end of the session, has sustained the white lie that New Zealand is an RJ paradise, while at the same time working in partnership with the settler colonial state here in ways that actively silence Māori critique and obstruct our ability to achieve self-determination in the realm of justice. The first significant component or part of my presentation, I've given the subtitle, Wiremu in Wonderland, the Restorative Justice Landscape in New Zealand. Wiremu is a boy's name, for those of you who don't know. Wiremu in Wonderland, the Restorative Justice Landscape in New Zealand. It's my kind of facetious way of underlining the mythologizing that goes on here and internationally, I think even more so, about the New Zealand restorative justice landscape. We need to acknowledge at the beginning, when talking about RJ in New Zealand, that when or at what point in time restorative justice developed as a recognizable justice practice, for want of a better term, in this country is difficult to establish. Some would argue that restorative justice type processes and principles were long practiced by my people going back centuries, if not millennia. So the insertion of restorative justice policies and interventions as we recognize them now in the early to mid 1990s was simply a contemporary Pākehā, which means Western/European addition to our traditional practices. However, in terms of contemporary manifestations, recognizable restorative justice policies and programs began to formulate here in the late 80s and continue to develop through the 90s until the present day. Now, according to one of the key advocates for restorative justice in New Zealand, Judge McElroy, a few years before the term restorative justice became known and widespread throughout this country, New Zealand introduced the FGC Forum through the 1989 SIPFA Act. And so doing the legislature here in this country began what he and others referred to as New Zealand's restorative justice revolution. In a 2002 article, McElroy goes on to detail the early evolution of restorative justice in New Zealand via the FGC Forum, and thus, quote, those like myself working with the Act soon saw it, talked about it, wrote about the FGC concept as a new model of justice. When I later returned to Cambridge on sabbatical leave and read Howard Zier's Changing Lenses, it seemed he was describing a very similar approach. In early 1994, I wrote two papers, the first assessing our youth justice model as a restorative model, and the second arguing for the application of its central principles to adults through community group conferences. End of quote. If one is to believe the literature, the really interesting and profound aspect of the early development of restorative justice in New Zealand is the centrality, is the importance of Māori justice philosophies and practices to the restorative evolution. Advocates regularly inform us, both here and internationally, that Māori critique of the formal justice system was in large part responsible for the development of Family Good Conferencing, which in time morphed into, of course, one of the leading restorative programs in the world. And there is some truth to those claims. Yes, I mean, the FGC Forum was constructed partly in response to Māori critique of the justice system. For example, in 1988, the year before the legislation was developed, we had the release of Moana Jackson's seminal research report, He Whaipangaho, Māori and the Criminal Justice System. And around about the same time, the release of the Ministerial Advisory Committee report into Youth Justice and Child Care Protection, both of which were damning, okay, of settler colonial government policy in the criminal justice sphere. However, a closer reading of the legislation, the 1989 Act, the policy framework that surrounded youth justice and family good conferencing at the time, and even today, and also of the little research, actual research, empirical research that has been done on the forum, exposes, in my view, the exaggerated mythological nature of the claims making of restorative justice advocates and entrepreneurs and the policy sector they work closely with in relation to both the forum and the role and impact of the restorative justice sector in relation to the wider justice system itself. Now, to paraphrase Kathleen Daly from her 2004 work, famous work, I think it's time to tell the real story about the supposed Māoriness of the Family Good Conferencing Forum and of restorative justice more widely in New Zealand. Actually, I mean, that's part of my notes, but that's wrong because I just realized, this is the second time I've had to record this because the first time there was something wrong with the mic. Anyway, I realized I'm rereading my notes again, that I realized that's wrong. It's time to tell this real story. We've been telling that story since the mid to the late 1990s. My first critique of the mythologizing of restorative justice in New Zealand was published in 1998. Kathy Love published her critique a few years later. All right, so that's 22 years. And yet when you still read new general overviews or discussions of restorative justice internationally, they're still citing Maxwell, Morris, McElroy, Considine, etc., and still referring to the mythologizing texts and ignoring the Indigenous critique. Anyway, right, getting off track a little bit. Yeah. So back to Kathleen Daly. Okay. In her groundbreaking article, Restorative Justice, the Real Story, from 2004, Daly identifies 4 myths associated with the RJ movement, namely that 1, restorative justice is the opposite of retributive justice. If, like me, you've sat in on a number of family good conferencing forums, you'll know that that definitely is not true. The demonization of young, particularly young Māori offenders, most especially young Māori boys, I said, is rife through the system. And Paolo Moyle, a Māori activist and social work researcher, research demonstrates that clearly. Second myth, restorative justice is a care or feminine response to crime in comparison to a justice or masculine response. Thirdly, restorative justice can be expected to produce major changes in people. And lastly, restorative justice uses Indigenous justice practices and was the dominant form of pre-modern justice. I would alter that last myth slightly because they do use Indigenous justice practices, right? Because that's what they claim, yeah. But I would argue that they do so badly and with disrespect, and it is ineffective in meeting our justice needs. Okay. Now, for the remainder of this section of the presentation, I'll focus on that last myth, that restorative justice uses components of Indigenous justice practices in a way that means it can produce interventions and incorporate our justice processes in a meaningful, respectful way, which in turn empowers us. This focus is necessary because that particular myth has been central to the successful globalization of the Family Good Conferencing Forum, but also the restorative justice industry overall over the last 20 to 25 years. The range of myths, or perhaps more accurately, purposeful misrepresentations associated with the forum are legion, beginning with the oft repeated claim that the forum was one of the first true restorative state-sponsored interventions in the Western world. In fact, the forum was never intended as an RJ process, nor was it designed to significantly empower Māori. And indeed, one of the key architects both of the legislation and the forum, Doolan, as far back as 2002, stated categorically in 2 articles that were published in that year. I think one's an article, the other is a publication of a presentation that he did, stated categorically it was never intended as an RJ process to empower the community, including us, to the extent that RJ activists and entrepreneurs claim. And as Suzuki and Woods argue in a 2017 publication, quote, while New Zealand is often set forth in the literature as the first country to implement restorative justice systemically, none of the architects of the Act, the 1989 Act, had ever heard of RJ when they included FGC as part of this Act. Rather, the forum was only part of a larger diversionary framework for the Act, such that its influence and notability as a restorative justice paradigm was only retrospectively understood. Nor has the, end of quote, nor has the process empowered Māori as advocates have claimed in the past and continue to do so today, despite evidence to the contrary. This claim is largely a fiction manufactured by restorative justice advocates and perpetuated by policy workers tasked with recuperating governmental control of the justice narrative in order to offset the wicked problems of Māori overrepresentation in crime statistics and an attempt to nullify our ongoing critique of the settler colonial states' justice processes in this country. Now, of late, advocates' assertions that the forum empowers Māori have been exposed as mythological, both by my own research and by that of Paul Moyle, who I mentioned earlier. I think Moyle's work in particular reveals wide-ranging dissatisfaction among Māori with the way in which the FGC forum has been run. Most especially problematic for her research participants, who actually included Māori social workers working in the system and youth offenders and their whānau or family members, were what they saw or experienced as the glaring contradictions between the supposedly indigenous foundations of the forum and their lived experience of it. Both sets of practitioners, need some water, and participants alike expressed disquiet at the tokenistic approach to Māori cultural philosophy and practice they experienced while sitting through state-run family group conferencing forums. This perspective is effectively summarized in comments from research participants, such as one who stated that, quote, the family group conference is about as restorative as it is culturally sensitive. In the same way, Pākehā or European social workers believe they are competent enough to work with our people regardless of their training. Pākehā think they are the natural, ordinary community against which all other ethnicities are measured, end of quote. Excuse me. And there was another, I think, interesting quote from one of her participants where they argued, quote, that whakapapa or genealogy is intrinsically linked to the development of tamariki or children. But unfortunately, it's something that the system does not recognize, let alone value. I've seen FGCs run without any whānau family showing up, where there's been little attempt to contact them or to empower them to attend. And then officials say it's their fault for not caring enough. And that's what the court report will show. It is the state that does not care, end of quote. The experiences of Moyle's research participants demonstrate that the family group conferencing forum does not always deliver the restorative process or outcomes that its advocates claim it does. I'd love to offer some more quotes from Paula's research, but I simply don't have the time here at this time. I argue that the forum has thus far failed to match the rhetoric of its advocates and their claims that it provides more culturally appropriate justice practice and a measure of jurisdiction empowerment to Māori. Now, when you combine that failure with evidence that some of the movement's members are purposefully and strategically utilising elements of Indigenous life worlds to enhance the marketability of their restorative justice products, then one quickly comes to the realisation that at this time, restorative justice as a movement, as a body of practitioners and advocates and entrepreneurs being those who do it to make money, the movement works more to support the settler colonial state than working for the disempowered or disaffected communities that reside in settler colonial context, most especially Indigenous people. The state's enthusiasm, and perhaps I also think this is the rationale, for claiming restorative justice and Indigenous-like status for interventions like the Family Good Conferencing Forum and other similarly indigenized programs, such as sentencing circles, that actually offer little in the way of empowerment, is beautifully captured in the following quote from Māori scholar Kathy Love, from an article she published in 2000, who wrote that, quote, "The apparent state commitment to a culturally appropriate and empowering process like the FGC Forum may in fact serve only to provide a brown veneer for a white system that has historically contributed to state-run programs of cultural genocide and whānau/family dismemberment," end of quote. The example of the FGC as mythologized restorative justice artifact reveals the political nature of crime control policy in the settler colonial context. And also, in my view, it demonstrates that the restorative justice industry is with their supposedly communitarian response to the violent state system, has been very much captured and subsumed within that particular colonial project, the colonial project of settler colonial crime control. In particular, it demonstrates how the settler colonial state has been successful in capturing projects or movements such as restorative justice that often start out as community-led, but always then are drawn into the ambit of the settler colonial state itself. Furthermore, it demonstrates the ease with which the mythologizing process can proceed. In the case of restorative justice as a movement and the Family Good Conferencing Forum as one of its supposed exemplar programs, the exaggerated claims of academics responsible for the initial evaluation of the forum, Maxwell and Morris, Considine, McElray, their exaggerated claims of the Māoriness, of the restorativeness of the forum, led it to developing into a core celebrate of the then New Justice movement. The reason why I'm repeating this claim, this statement, is because the exaggerated representation of the forum at that time meant that it became instrumental. The forum became instrumental in restorative justice becoming an essential part of the New Zealand settler colonial state's justice processes. An important or key component in the state's ongoing project to portray itself as a good treaty partner for Māori, a good treaty partner, not to empower us as a treaty partner, but to present itself as a good treaty partner. Perhaps most significantly, the success of advocates and policy workers in portraying the forum as both Indigenous-inspired and restorative led to it becoming a popular response to the Indigenous problem and other settler colonial jurisdictions with significant negative consequences for other Indigenous people. Which brings me to the next section or part of my talk, which is subtitled Leaving Wonderland, Exporting the Family Good Conference to the World. It is evident in the literature that over the past 20 years, the forum has been uprooted and globalized to such an extent that it is one of the most popular commodities on the international crime control market. While the forum has proved popular in many Western jurisdictions, it has proved especially so in settler colonial contexts or jurisdictions of Canada, Australia, and to a certain extent the US as well. And of course, each of these jurisdictions has high rates of Indigenous offending and imprisonment, and has stroppy Indigenous people critiquing settler colonial crime control, just as we have here in New Zealand. In this section, it will be argued, firstly, that what has been exported and globalized is not restorative justice as such, but rather a state-centered or at least supported responsibilization forum that over time has been stripped of any true restorativeness and communitarianism. If we accept at face value the value claims of the restorative justice movement with regards to their core principles and values. This has occurred as a result of the increasing standardization of the forum, which has culled from the intervention the very communitarianism necessary for it to be considered truly restorative when we set it against those principles. I would also argue that much of the marketing of New Zealand restorative justice has exaggerated the restorativeness of interventions, and most especially, of course, this indigenousness of various fora that has now been marketed on the globalized crime control market. There is growing anecdotal evidence that the global transfer of crime control policy is negatively impacting Indigenous people. And this is particularly evident in the restorative and youth justice context. From a distance, it appears that the process is impacting Indigenous peoples in a number of ways, including that it has been very effective for the containment of Indigenous critique of the formal justice systems of settler colonial states through the production of state-centered indigenized policies and programs. And secondly, highly useful as it has been in, well, I don't know if it's been successful in New Zealand, but it's certainly one of the, if you like, as I mentioned before, drivers of state work in the restorative justice area. Very useful for blocking Indigenous activities which are aimed at enhancing their jurisdictional autonomy, their ability to develop their own responses to social harm. Okay, blocking them via the importation of these culturally appropriate, okay, and indigenized programs. It is apparent that New Zealand's Family Youth Conferencing Forum was purposefully marketed in other settler colonial jurisdictions, especially Canada, as Indigenous inspired or Indigenous focused programs. It is also evident that the marketing of such products was aided by academic literature that promoted the Māori origin myths of the forum that we discussed earlier. Now, at an early stage in the process of globalization, a small number of Indigenous scholars actually signaled disquiet with the importation of the SGC forum impact it was having on their people. For example, in 1997, Gloria Lee, who is a member of the Cree First Nation in Canada, published an article titled The Newest Old Gem Family Group Conferencing. In this work, Lee expressed concerns about the recently imported forum being forced upon Canadian Indigenous peoples at the expense of the development and implementation of their own processes. She argued that, quote, First Nation communities are vigorously encouraged to adopt and implement the Māori process and to make alterations to fit to that forum, to fit the specific community needs, customs, and traditions of people who will make use of the new process, end of quote. Lee's concerns with the nature of the import and impact of the importation of the FGC process, especially the impact that it might have on Indigenous people's justice aspirations in that country, have since been shown to be valid. In the 20 years since the publication of Lee's article, many Canadian Indigenous peoples are still struggling to gain support for the implementation of their own justice process. And we can demonstrate the negative impact by just citing or discussing one case study, that of the Stalo First Nation of British Columbia, and their experience of the importation of the supposedly Māori justice process, the FGC, by the Royal Mounties in the mid-1990s. Now, Katz and Bonham in the 2006 article relate that in 1997, the Royal Mounties adopted a policy which gave the police the discretion to utilise restorative justice. Based on New Zealand-style conferencing format as it was then being spruiked and marketed throughout Canada by people like Australians like Moore and O'Connell, the Royal Mounties subsequently developed guidelines for community justice forums, and over time the forum spread across Canada. So this brings us to a friend of mine, Dr. Winona Hall, criminologist and activist from the Stalo Nation in the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. And her work underlines the negative impact the importation of FGCs to Canada initially had on First Nation justice aspirations in that jurisdiction. Winona was asked to work with, I think, Elders Council, to the Stalo people to try and reinvigorate their traditional justice processes, their way of responding to social harm, Koikako style. Part of that process meant that they had to talk to, for example, the police, et cetera, about to try and get agreements or contracts, whatever you want to call it, so that they would receive and be able to deal with, for example, youth offenders, just as an example. And part of that process, when we went into that dialogue, they were told, yeah, we were happy to consider that kind of reciprocal relationship. We arrest them, you deal with them. But you have to use this particular process that we've now contracted to utilize, which is family good conferencing. But it's okay for you. I'm paraphrasing what she was told by the police and what have you, because it's an Indigenous focused program, right? And because through the style of being Indigenous, hey, obviously it must work for them. And not only that, but they said, well, yeah, but we can give you training in it. So they had to pay for training in the supposedly Māori program, right? And she talks about, she's got some wonderful quotes in her work about their experience of being trained in the so-called Indigenous forum. So she says, quote, on the first day of training, we all eagerly awaited her, the trainer's arrival. We were somewhat surprised to see an extremely white-looking woman enter the room. However, we have blonde, blue-eyed, even red-headed Stalo among us, and so too we presumed must be Māori. However, it did not take us long to come to realise this lady was not Māori, as it was in fact Hawaiian or European. My apologies to any Stalo listening in for my horrible pronunciation of that word. The Māori had sent Hawaiian. Okay, we do that too on occasion. It is one of the many ironies of colonisation whereby Hawaiian often become our teachers. There are times when it is in Hawaiian who is recognised as the Stalo expert and therefore is the one talking even when there are elders present. But by the end of the 3-day training course, I was convinced the Māori had lost their minds. I really like that bit. There was absolutely nothing Indigenous about this model of justice whatsoever. End of quote. And then, in fact, a few years after that, she read one of my first critiques of the mythologizing and misrepresentation of FGCs as an Indigenous process, and she had an aha moment, a realization that it was non-Indigenous scholars in the policy sector in New Zealand that were purposely misrepresenting the forum. The global spread of that forum, especially across settler colonial jurisdictions, is testament to the power of the marketing arm of the restorative justice movement and its swift incorporation into the formal justice system, most especially in settler colonial contexts. The constant erroneous and exaggerated claims of the Māoriness of the forum, which frankly, I'm getting tired of having to talk about, but we have to keep talking about it because a lot of you listening in here and probably so your colleagues keep doing it. The constant erroneous and exaggerated claims of the Māoriness of the forum and the extent to which it supposedly works as a restorative process have been instrumental in the globalization of restorative justice. And that has brought real negative consequences, both for Māori, who have seen our activism for a true measure of jurisdictional autonomy diverted, into the centralized, heavily bureaucratic and scripted forum, and for other Indigenous peoples like the Stalo, who were forced to undertake training for the process that they had to pay for, that was not Indigenous inspired, at the expense of being able to focus their resources on developing a process based on their own needs, their own philosophies, and their own practices. This brings me into the concluding comments I wish to make. Without question, restorative justice policy and practice has become an important part of the criminal justice landscape across most Western jurisdictions, including this country. That the movement developed due to profound concerns by justice activists for the many failings of formal systems of justice is unquestionable. And for that reason, the early manifestations of restorative justice programs were clearly influenced by values that were at odds, excuse me, that were at odds with those that drive the development of state crime control and its practice, such as, for example, a meaningful participation of victims of crime in the process and the justice process, a focus on inquisitorial mediation and dialogue, and a concern for the meaningful reintegration of both offenders and victims back into their communities of concern. However, along the way, something really interesting happened. Restorative justice in New Zealand and elsewhere became consumed by the state. Consumed, not subsumed, consumed, because that's a violent act. Consumed by the state to such an extent that today it is a significant part of the formal settler colonial justice landscape. The envelopment of the movement by the state was in large part the result of three interrelated developments that coalesced in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s. Namely, the passing of New Zealand CIPRA Act and with it the introduction of the FGC Forum. Secondly, the RJ advocates and criminologists started miraculously discovering and promoting the restorative and Indigenous elements of the forum. Actually, that's 2 and 3, the development of the myth of the forum's Māoriness and Indigenousness. As I have previously pointed out, while the mythologizing associated with the forum has made New Zealand restorative justice practice, for want of a better term, processes, philosophies, whatever, that has made us well regarded throughout the world, it has not been without its negative consequences either for us, Māori, or for other Indigenous peoples. In New Zealand, empirical research by Māori scholars such as myself and Paola and others is challenging the mythologizing of the forum as both a restorative process and one that empowers us. Our research demonstrates clearly that Māori participants are often well aware of the tokenistic treatment of their cultural values and practices by the officials, the state officials who dominate the forum. And the performance of our restorative justice entrepreneurs and advocates and their ongoing mythologizing of restorative justice empower state officials, to treat us in such a disrespectful way. Furthermore, research by Indigenous scholars like Winona Hall highlight the nefarious impact that the misleading marketing of restorative justice products by restorative justice entrepreneurs has had on Indigenous peoples like hers who are attempting to reinvigorate and reintroduce their own traditional justice institutions. This brings me to the very last thing I want to say, which is where to from here. So what is to be done about this situation? Well, I'll start by saying this. It is apparent that we, meaning Māori here in New Zealand, and just as likely I would say Indigenous peoples residing in other settler colonial contexts, it is apparent that we cannot rely on the restorative justice industry to support our right to self-determination in the realm of justice any more than we can the settler colonial state. There is too much at stake for the restorative justice movement, You guys make too much money. You get too much of your mana, your authority from your relationship, your parasitic relationship with the state. And it's hardly surprising that we can trust neither of you, given the extent to which the restorative justice movement has bifurcated into two distinct camps. Those who believe in, I know I'm simplifying, which is a complex relationship, yeah, but too bad. Those who believe in the founding communitarian values and philosophies of the early iterations of the movement, we'll call them, the RJ idealists. Right? And the second camp, the camp that's been most influential, those who believe that the way forward is to partner with the state, build a meaningful place for our restorative justice in the formal system. They would probably refer to themselves as the RJ or restorative justice pragmatists. I prefer the term restorative justice entrepreneurs because I find that a lot of their focus is on their prestige, making money, building a relationship with a violent and state system. Now, members of both of these camps are in actual fact responsible through their mythologizing work for turning New Zealand into the land of the long white lie, that lie being that we are a haven of RJ practice and Indigenous empowerment. But the entrepreneurs are primarily responsible for the situation. The entrepreneurs have long held sway over the misrepresentation of restorative justice in New Zealand in international context, as evidenced in their past and ongoing influence on the policy industry and its activities. Their lack of engagement with Māori, who make up over a third of the RJ workforce in this country, and in some places up to 70% of the client base, is palpable. Their disregard for the Māori perspective and experience is evident in the lack of critical, sophisticated, well-resourced and sustained research with Māori. Note I said with and not on. It's also evident in their continued reliance on the importation of knowledge and expertise to further the development of their accreditation programs, whilst ignoring our own localized and culturally meaningful expertise for whatever reason. And this is a situation at the failed Restorative Justice Centre at AUT, University of Auckland in the 2000s, and I would argue in its current iteration at Victoria University in Wellington. That centre, by the way, in Wellington, is one that became known to me earlier this year, has been looking at or aspires to be an RJ Centre of Research Excellence, which I think is commendable. But I'm not sure how they're going to do that, given that throughout their history, they've really carried out any significant research on Māori issues, nor in fact hired Māori or our non-critical, or our non-Māori but critical allies who have significant relationship with us, who can facilitate this activity in a meaningful, respectful way. Nor has it developed, I believe, or from what I've been hearing on the ground, accreditation programs that resonate with the needs of Māori practitioners and whānau hapu or iwi participants. Now, for this reason, because this is what the landscape is in New Zealand at the moment, I offer two suggestions in response to the question, so what is the way forward? How do we move from the land of the long white lie to the land of Indigenous empowerment in the realm of justice? My answer is a simple one, although albeit tinged with recognition of the complexities facing any project aimed at decolonising state practice or the Pākehā/Western Academy that supports it, and in full knowledge that both of those entities, the state and the RJ entrepreneurs, will move heaven and earth to protect their hegemony over restorative justice, knowledge and practice in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My two solutions then are as follows. One, we, Māori, enhance knowledge of our own issues, of our own effective practice, by designing, undertaking and completing our own Māori-centred and directed research. And this process has already begun with recent discussions between myself and some leading RJ Māori practitioners to set up a research program, the development of related funding applications. Although I'm going to set the program of research up in such a way that we do not need significant funding, but we will be armed with empirically informed knowledge empirically informed knowledge that we can then use to combat the mythologizing of the restorative justice entrepreneurs and the settler colonial state. And hopefully maybe even embarrass them into stop making these claims and to open up to the different ways of being restorative. The second solution is that we need to develop and deliver Māori-focused accreditation programs for restorative justice and social justice program delivery. And we will do so in the next few years, I hope, in participation or in partnership, with Māori education providers. The only way, I believe, to achieve self-determination and justice in this country is to make the policy sector and its restorative justice entrepreneurs or its partners irrelevant, and ourselves, our whānau, our communities, the centre of our practice. Kia ora everyone, thank you very much for listening, and I hope that that was useful.